During my father's hospital stay, I snuck into his room after visiting hours, but I caught his doctor injecting something into his IV. What she did when she saw me made my blood freeze. The syringe was already half empty when I pushed open the door, the clear liquid disappearing into the IV line that fed into my father's arm. Dr. Amanda Schultz didn't startle or jump like someone caught doing something wrong. Instead, she turned her head slowly toward me, her face completely calm, almost serene. She finished depressing the plunger with deliberate precision, withdrew the needle, and capped it with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. Then she smiled at me, this warm, professional smile that made my stomach drop, and brought one finger to her lips in a shushing gesture. She said softly that visiting hours were over, that my father needed his rest, that I should go home and come back tomorrow during normal hours. Her voice was gentle, almost motherly, but her eyes were completely flat, empty of any warmth or humanity. She said she'd just given him something to help him sleep, that he'd been restless and uncomfortable, that this would make him more comfortable. The way she said comfortable, drawing out the syllables like it was some kind of inside joke, made my hands start shaking. I asked what she'd given him, and she said just a mild sedative, nothing to worry about, standard post-operative care. But the syringe in her hand wasn't labeled, and there was no cart with medications, no chart notation being made, no witness present like there should be for medication administration. I'd been visiting my father at Memorial Hospital in Chicago for 5 days since his surgery. He'd gone in for what should have been routine, a hernia repair that his primary care doctor had recommended after months of discomfort. My father was 63, generally healthy despite being overweight and having controlled hypertension, active enough to still work as a contractor and handle physical labor. The surgery had gone well according to the surgeon, Dr. Leonard Gates, who'd told us the repair was successful, and my father should recover fully within a few weeks. The first 2 days post-op had been normal, my father groggy and in pain, but improving steadily, eating small meals, walking the hallways with a nurse to prevent blood clots, making jokes about the hospital food and how he couldn't wait to get home. Dr. Schultz was the hospitalist assigned to manage his care during the stay, a woman in her early 40s with an impressive resume posted on the hospital website. Board certified in internal medicine, 15 years of experience, multiple awards for patient care excellence. She'd seemed attentive and professional during her rounds, always smiling, always asking how my father felt, always assuring us he was progressing exactly as expected. But something had changed on day 3. My father had seemed more confused that morning, having trouble focusing on conversations, complaining of nausea that the nurses said was unusual for someone at his stage of recovery. Dr. Schultz had examined him during her afternoon rounds, with me present in the room, and declared everything normal. She said some patients experienced more post-operative symptoms than others, that his vital signs were stable, that we shouldn't worry. She'd increased his pain medication and added something she called an anti-nausea agent to his IV. That night he'd been even worse, barely responsive when I'd visited after work, his skin pale and clammy, his breathing shallow. The night nurse had said, "Doctor." Schultz had been by to check on him, had adjusted his medications again, had assured staff he was fine. By day 4, my father could barely stay awake, drifting in and out of consciousness, his words slurred when he did speak. I demanded to speak with Dr. Gates, the surgeon, but was told he only handled surgical issues and post-operative care was Dr. Schultz's responsibility. I'd asked Dr. Schultz directly if something was wrong, and she'd given me that same warm, professional smile and said sometimes recovery wasn't linear, that my father was older and might take longer to bounce back, that patience was important. Day 5. Today, my father had been completely unresponsive when I'd arrived during visiting hours. Not sleeping, but unconscious in a way that felt deeply wrong. His pulse was there but weak, his breathing ragged, his skin cool to the touch. I'd called for nurses, demanded answers, been told Dr. Schultz had examined him an hour earlier and adjusted his treatment plan. They showed me her notes on the chart saying patient experiencing expected post-surgical fatigue, medications optimized for comfort, family reassured. Except I hadn't been reassured. I'd been terrified. My father looked like he was dying, and everyone kept telling me he was fine. Visiting hours ended at 8 p.m., and I'd been ushered out by a polite but firm nurse who said I could return tomorrow at 10 a.m. I'd driven halfway home before the wrongness of everything overwhelmed me, and I turned around, parked in the visitor lot, and snuck back into the hospital through a side entrance I'd noticed staff using. Memorial wasn't a high-security facility, no ID checks after regular hours, just a security guard at the main desk who barely looked up from his phone as I walked past carrying a coffee cup like I belonged there. I'd taken the elevator to the 4th floor where my father's room was, moved quietly down the dimmed hallway past the nurses' station, where 2 nurses were absorbed in paperwork, and slipped into room 418. If you are enjoying this story already, please subscribe to see more stories like this. That's when I'd caught Dr. Schultz standing over my father, syringe in hand, injecting something directly into his IV port. The shock of seeing her there at 9:30 p.m., well past when hospitalists normally made rounds, in a dark room with just the dim glow of monitors, should have triggered immediate alarm. But it was her reaction when she saw me that crystallized my fear into certainty that something terrible was happening. That calm smile, that shushing gesture, the complete lack of surprise or guilt. She wasn't startled because she'd expected to be alone. She wasn't defensive because she believed she had complete control of the situation. She moved past me toward the door, still holding the empty syringe, and said again that I should go home, that everything was fine, that she'd take good care of my father. Then she left, pulling the door closed behind her, her footsteps quiet on the linoleum as she walked away. I stood there frozen for maybe 10 seconds before I moved to my father's bedside, checked his pulse, found it even weaker than before, found his breathing more labored. I pressed the call button for the nurse, and when Beverly Clark came in asking what I needed, I told her I thought something was wrong with my father, that he seemed worse. She checked his vitals and frowned, said his blood pressure had dropped, said she'd notify the doctor. I asked which doctor, and she said Dr. Schultz was still in the building. She'd seen her at the nurse's station a few minutes ago. I grabbed Beverly's arm and asked her to stay with my father, said I didn't want him left alone, said I'd seen Dr. Schultz inject something into his IV, and I wanted to know what it was. Beverly looked confused and said she didn't have any medication orders from Dr. Schultz in the past hour, that if the doctor had given something, it should be in the chart. She pulled up the electronic records on the room computer and showed me that the last documented medication was from 6 p.m. before I'd left for the evening. Nothing about a 9:30 p.m. injection. I told her I'd watched it happen. I'd been in this room. I'd seen the syringe. Beverly's expression shifted from confusion to concern, and she said she needed to report this. That medication administration without charting was a serious violation. She called the charge nurse while I stood there with my heart hammering, watching my father's chest rise and fall in shallow, insufficient breaths. The charge nurse arrived, a stern older woman who introduced herself as Margaret Flynn, and I had to explain again what I'd witnessed. Margaret asked if I was sure it had been Dr. Schultz, and I said absolutely certain. I'd spoken to her. She'd told me to leave. Margaret's jaw tightened, and she said she was calling the night administrator, that this needed to be addressed immediately. The night administrator, Richard Vaughn, arrived within 15 minutes. He was a thin man in his 50s wearing a suit despite the late hour, clearly someone who took hospital operations seriously. He listened to my account with increasing alarm, asked detailed questions about timing and what I'd observed. He pulled up my father's chart on the room computer and reviewed recent entries, comparing them to the medication administration record. He said there were no orders for evening sedation or any other medication that would require IV injection at this time. He asked Beverly if she'd seen Dr. Schultz on the floor, and she confirmed seeing her near the nurse's station around 9:20 p.m. Vaughn asked if that was unusual, and Beverly said yes. Hospitalists rarely did rounds that late unless there was an emergency, and there hadn't been any emergencies tonight. Vaughn said he was going to review security footage and speak with Dr. Schultz directly, that in the meantime, my father's care would be transferred to the on-call physician, and we'd monitor him closely for any adverse reactions to whatever he'd been given. He asked if I'd be willing to file a formal complaint, and I said absolutely. I wanted to know what my father had been injected with and why it wasn't documented. I stayed in my father's room while Vaughn made calls and reviewed footage. A different doctor arrived, Dr. Helen Marsh, an older woman who introduced herself as the senior physician on call tonight. She examined my father thoroughly, reviewed his chart, and ordered immediate blood work to check for toxic substances or medication overdoses. She said his symptoms, the progressive deterioration over the past 3 days combined with sudden worsening tonight, were consistent with poisoning rather than post-surgical complications. The word poisoning hit me like a physical blow. I asked if she meant someone was deliberately harming him, and she said she couldn't make that determination yet, but the pattern was concerning enough to warrant investigation. She said she was calling toxicology to run comprehensive screens, that the blood draw would happen immediately. A phlebotomist came and took multiple vials while I held my father's hand, his skin cold and clammy under my palm. Dr. Marsh said she was also starting supportive care, fluids and medications to stabilize his blood pressure and support his organs while they figured out what was happening. She said the next few hours would be critical. Vaughn returned at 11 p.m. with a laptop and a grim expression. He said the security footage from the 4th floor hallway showed Dr. Schultz entering room 418 at 9:23 p.m., carrying something in her pocket, staying for approximately 6 minutes, then leaving at 9:29 p.m. The footage showed me entering the room at 9:27 p.m., meaning I'd arrived while she was still in there. He said Dr. Schultz had been paged to return to the hospital for an urgent meeting, but wasn't responding to calls or pages, that hospital security had been sent to her home address on file. He said this was being treated as a potential criminal matter, and he'd already notified the hospital's legal counsel and risk management team. He said I needed to speak with the police, and he'd called the Chicago PD, that detectives were on their way. He apologized repeatedly, said if Dr. Schultz had indeed administered unauthorized medication to my father, it was an unconscionable violation of trust and medical ethics, that the hospital would cooperate fully with any investigation. I asked why she would do this, and he said he had no answer, that it made no sense, that Dr. Schultz had been an excellent physician with an impeccable record. 2 detectives arrived just after midnight. Detective William Crawford was a broad-shouldered man in his early 50s with gray hair and sharp blue eyes that seemed to miss nothing. His partner, Detective Lisa Brennan, was younger, maybe mid-30s, with dark hair pulled back tight and an intensity that suggested she took her work very seriously. Crawford introduced himself as having 23 years with the CPD, specializing in assault and battery cases. Brennan had 14 years in major crimes. They took my statement in a conference room down the hall while nurses monitored my father. I walked them through everything, from my father's initial surgery to his mysterious decline to catching Dr. Schultz with the syringe tonight. Crawford took detailed notes while Brennan recorded the conversation on a digital device. They asked about my father's health history, whether he had any enemies, whether there were any disputes over money or property. I explained he was a regular guy, a contractor, no drama or conflicts I knew about. They asked about my relationship with him, and I said it was good. We talked weekly. I'd taken time off work to be here during his surgery and recovery. They asked why I'd come back after visiting hours, and I said instinct, fear, the sense that something was very wrong that no one else seemed to see. Dr. Marsh came to the conference room at 1:15 a.m. with preliminary results. The toxicology screen had found elevated levels of potassium chloride in my father's blood, far higher than normal, at concentrations that suggested external administration rather than natural occurrence. She explained that potassium chloride in high doses could cause cardiac arrest, that it was sometimes used in executions, that in medical settings it had to be administered very carefully and slowly because rapid injection could be fatal. She said the amount in my father's system suggested multiple doses over several days, each one weakening his heart and organs, building toward a final lethal dose. She said if I hadn't interrupted Dr. Schultz tonight, the injection I'd witnessed might have been enough to kill him. She said my father was currently stable but critical, that they were treating the potassium toxicity aggressively, that the next 24 hours would determine if he survived. Crawford asked if there was any medical reason Dr. Schultz would have been giving potassium chloride, and Dr. Marsh said absolutely not. My father's potassium levels had been normal. There was no clinical indication for supplementation, and even if there had been, it would never be given via rapid IV push the way I'd described. Crawford said they needed to locate Dr. Schultz immediately, that this was now attempted murder investigation. He called for additional units to check her home, her known associates, anywhere she might have gone. Brennan started pulling Dr. Schultz's employment records and background information from hospital HR. Vaughn provided access to everything, clearly terrified of the liability and publicity nightmare unfolding. Within an hour, they had a more complete picture. Amanda Schultz, 42 years old, divorced, no children, living alone in an apartment in Lincoln Park. She'd worked at Memorial Hospital for 8 years, previously at 2 other hospitals in Illinois before that. Her medical license was active and clear of complaints. Her personnel file showed excellent performance reviews and multiple patient satisfaction awards. On paper, she was the ideal physician. Brennan said she was requesting records from the previous hospitals to see if there were any similar incidents or complaints that might not have been formally filed. Crawford said they were also pulling death records for patients under Dr. Schultz's care to look for patterns. The security team sent to Dr. Schultz's apartment reported back at 3 a.m. that she wasn't there, her car wasn't in the parking garage, there was no answer at the door. Crawford obtained a warrant to enter the apartment and search for evidence of her whereabouts or evidence related to the poisoning. When they got inside at 5 a.m., they found her laptop open on the kitchen table, still logged in. Brennan, who had some computer forensics training, started examining the search history and documents while wearing gloves. What she found made the investigation explode into something much larger. Dr. Schultz had been researching potassium chloride poisoning for months, reading medical literature about detection and dosing, visiting forums about serial killers and angels of death in medical settings. She had spreadsheets tracking patients, their room numbers, their conditions, dates, and times of her visits. She had detailed notes about symptoms and deterioration, clinical observations written with the detachment of a researcher documenting an experiment. There were 38 patients listed over the past 3 years. 31 of them had died. Brennan called Crawford over, and they photographed everything, called for additional detectives and technical specialists to process the apartment as a crime scene. They pulled the patient names from the spreadsheets and started cross-referencing with hospital death records. Every single one of the deceased patients had died during or shortly after Dr. Schultz's shifts. Every single one had been under her direct care. The causes of death varied: heart attacks, respiratory failure, strokes, sepsis, all things that could happen naturally in hospitalized patients, all things that might mask murder if done carefully. My father was number 39 on the list. Next to his name was a notation that said stubborn recovery, requires full dose. The clinical coldness of that phrase, describing the murder of a human being like it was a medical treatment plan, made me want to vomit when Brennan showed me the photograph she'd taken. Crawford said they were getting warrants for Dr. Schultz's financial records, phone records, anything that might explain motive or help locate her. He said I should prepare for the possibility that this investigation would take time, that Dr. Schultz had apparently been doing this for years without detection, that she'd be on the run now that she knew she'd been caught. The hospital went into crisis mode as the scope of the investigation became clear. Vaughn called an emergency meeting with the CEO and chief medical officer, briefed them on the preliminary findings, watched as the reality sank in that they had a serial killer on staff who'd been murdering patients for years. The hospital's legal team started reviewing all deaths under Dr. Schultz's care, preparing for inevitable lawsuits and criminal liability questions. The medical staff was interviewed about their interactions with her, whether they'd noticed anything unusual, whether there had been any red flags. No one had seen anything. Dr. Schultz had been friendly, competent, well-liked. She'd never missed a shift, never had a complaint, Never given anyone reason to suspect she was systematically killing patients. The perfect mask, hiding a monster. My father regained consciousness on day 6, groggy and weak, but alive. The potassium toxicity treatment had worked, pulling him back from the edge of death. Dr. Marsh said he'd been incredibly lucky, that another hour of delay might have been too late. I told my father what had happened and watched his face go through confusion, disbelief, and horror. He remembered Dr. Schultz being kind and attentive, remembered trusting her completely, couldn't process that she'd been slowly killing him. He asked how many others, and I told him what the investigation had found, watched him cry for the patients who hadn't survived, the people who'd trusted their doctor and died for it. He asked if they'd caught her yet, and I said no, she was still in the wind, but every law enforcement agency in the state was looking for her. Dr. Schultz was found 4 days later in a motel outside St. Louis, arrested without incident by local police acting on a tip. She was extradited back to Chicago and charged with 31 counts of first-degree murder and 8 counts of attempted murder, including my father. The evidence from her apartment, combined with medical records and toxicology findings, built an overwhelming case. The hospital cooperated fully, turning over everything they had, desperate to demonstrate they'd had no knowledge of her actions. Autopsies were ordered on recently deceased victims, exhumations requested for others. The pattern became undeniable. Dr. Schultz had been selecting patients who were vulnerable, elderly, or very ill, people whose deaths might not raise immediate suspicion. She'd administer potassium chloride in doses carefully calculated to cause cardiac events that looked natural. She'd document normal care in the charts while conducting murder outside the records. She'd been doing it for at least 3 years at Memorial, possibly longer at her previous hospitals. The trial was a media sensation, one of those cases that captures public attention because it violates the most fundamental trust we have in medical professionals. The prosecution called 58 witnesses, including me, family members of victims, medical experts, detectives who'd processed evidence. They presented the laptop, the spreadsheets, the search history, the autopsy results showing potassium toxicity. They showed security footage of Dr. Schultz entering patient rooms at odd hours, staying briefly, leaving. They presented testimony from nurses who'd noticed unexplained deaths, but had been reassured by Dr. Schultz that everything was medically appropriate. The defense had almost nothing to work with. Dr. Schultz's attorney, a public defender named Raymond Clark, tried to argue that the evidence was circumstantial, that sick people died in hospitals naturally, that the potassium findings could be explained by medical conditions or treatment complications. The prosecution destroyed that argument with expert testimony and statistical analysis showing the death rate among Dr. Schultz's patients was 43% higher than among other hospitalists' patients, an impossible variance to explain by chance or patient acuity. If this story keeps your interest, please subscribe to get more stories like this. Dr. Schultz herself never testified, never explained why she'd done it. Psychiatric evaluations found her competent to stand trial, but couldn't determine clear motive. She wasn't financially motivated, hadn't benefited from the deaths. She wasn't euthanizing patients to end suffering, had selected victims who were recovering well alongside those who were terminal. She appeared to have killed simply because she could, because she enjoyed the power and control, because watching people die gave her some satisfaction that normal medical care didn't. The psychologist who evaluated her, Dr. Jonathan Pierce, with 25 years of forensic experience, testified that she fit the profile of an angel of death killer, medical professionals who murder patients under their care for psychological gratification. He said they were rare but devastating, able to kill for years because their position gives them access, authority, and opportunity. He said Dr. Schultz showed no remorse, no empathy for victims or families, no real emotional response to being caught beyond irritation that her activities had been interrupted. The jury convicted on all counts after deliberating for 6 hours. Dr. Schultz showed no reaction as the verdicts were read, sitting calmly at the defense table as if this was happening to someone else. The judge, a stern woman named Justice Barbara Fleming with 32 years on the bench, sentenced her to 31 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. Fleming said, "Dr. Schultz had violated the most sacred trust in society, the belief that those who care for us in our most vulnerable moments will help rather than harm. She said the defendant had weaponized her medical knowledge and position to commit serial murder, had betrayed patients, families, colleagues, and the entire medical profession. She said the consecutive sentences ensured Dr. Schultz would never be free, would spend the rest of her life in prison contemplating the lives she'd stolen." Dr. Schultz was led away in handcuffs, disappearing into the prison system where she remains today. My father recovered fully from the physical effects of the poisoning, though the psychological impact lingered. He had nightmares about being helpless in a hospital bed while his doctor killed him. He developed severe medical anxiety, avoiding doctors and hospitals whenever possible, unable to trust the healthcare system that had so catastrophically failed him. He saw a therapist, a woman named Dr. Catherine Wells, who specialized in trauma, and slowly worked through the betrayal and fear. He said the hardest part was knowing how close he'd come to being just another statistic, another elderly patient who died in the hospital from apparent heart failure, mourned by his family who'd never know he'd been murdered. He said he owed me his life, and I said I'd just trusted my instincts when something felt wrong, that I was lucky I'd acted on that feeling instead of dismissing it like I'd been trained to do when authorities assured me everything was fine. The hospital faced 53 lawsuits from families of confirmed or suspected victims. Most settled out of court for undisclosed amounts, the hospital clearly desperate to avoid prolonged trials and additional publicity. Several executives were fired or resigned over the failure to detect Dr. Schultz's pattern of murders. New protocols were implemented requiring oversight of medication administration, mandatory reviews of death rates among individual physicians, toxicology screens for unexpected deaths. Memorial's reputation took years to rebuild, if it ever fully did. The building where my father had been poisoned was eventually demolished and replaced with a medical office complex, as if destroying the physical space could somehow erase what had happened there. I think about that night constantly. The image of Dr. Schultz standing over my father with that syringe burned into my memory. The calm smile, the shushing gesture, the absolute certainty in her demeanor that she was in control, that I posed no threat to her carefully constructed pattern of murder. She'd been so confident in the system protecting her, in people's trust of doctors, in the assumption that deaths in hospitals were natural and expected. She'd been right for years, killing without consequence, adding names to her spreadsheet like they were accomplishments rather than crimes. The only reason my father survived was pure chance, my decision to go back after visiting hours, my arrival at the exact moment she was administering what probably would have been the fatal dose. 5 minutes earlier or later, and I'd have missed her entirely, would have found my father dead in the morning, would have been told he'd suffered an unexpected cardiac event, and there was nothing anyone could have done. The investigation revealed that 2 other hospitalists at Dr. Schultz's previous hospitals had also had suspicious death rates among their patients, but those patterns had never been flagged or investigated. The medical profession was forced to confront the reality that angel of death killers operated in their ranks, protected by the same trust and authority that made them effective caregivers when used ethically. New databases were created to track deaths across hospitals, looking for patterns that might indicate serial murder. Medical boards strengthened oversight and investigation procedures. The case became a teaching example in medical ethics courses and criminal justice programs, a demonstration of how institutional trust can enable monsters and how important it is to listen when something feels wrong, even when all the official channels say everything is fine. My father lived another 8 years before dying of natural causes, a stroke at age 71 that the autopsy confirmed was genuine and expected given his medical history. His death was investigated thoroughly because of what had happened with Dr. Schultz, every detail examined to ensure this time it really was natural. I was glad for that scrutiny, glad to know for certain that his death was just biology failing rather than human malice. I spoke at his funeral about how he'd been given 8 bonus years by a stroke of luck, by my decision to trust my instincts over official reassurances, by catching a killer in the act and stopping her before she could finish. I said those 8 years had been precious, time we'd spent closer than before, bound by shared trauma and the knowledge of how fragile life could be. I said I'd learned from him that sometimes the most important thing you can do is refuse to accept what you're told when your gut screams that something is wrong. That questioning authority and demanding answers can literally save lives. The syringe Dr. Schultz had been holding that night was never found, probably disposed of in a sharps container or trash can before she fled. But the evidence it represented, the pattern of murders it was part of, destroyed her freedom and exposed a serial killer who'd hidden in plain sight for years. I keep a newspaper clipping from the trial verdict in my desk drawer, looking at it sometimes when I need to remind myself that justice is possible, that monsters can be stopped, that one person noticing wrongness and refusing to ignore it can change everything. The headline reads, "Hospital Doctor Convicted of 31 Murders," and below it is a photo of Dr. Schultz being led to prison, her expression still calm and unbothered, as if even then she couldn't quite believe her perfect system had failed. I hope she thinks about my father every day in her cell, the patient who got away because someone loved him enough to question, to investigate, to refuse the comfortable lie that everything was fine when every instinct screamed it wasn't. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.